Sergei Grigoriev was the quintessential mountain man that we only see on TV. He'd grown up on the outskirts of Ozersk, Russia, on a small plot of land where he and his family grew all of their own food. Sergei's brother and two sisters grew up and moved away to the city, studying to become nurses and a mechanic. But Sergei knew since he was a boy that he'd never leave the grounds on which he was born. He lived for the woods and the fresh air. All he needed was a rifle to bring home dinner and to make some money on the side by selling the massive musk oxens that he had become so good at tracking. Occasionally he sold fur from animals he'd caught in one of his traps. Sergei was alone with his two dogs that he'd found abandoned during his excursions in the forest, and they were enough to keep him company. But Sergei also had another more unusual pet, a brown bear named Vorchun, which translates to grumbler. The 4-year-old bear was one of two cubs that Sergei found hiding in the hollow of a boulder after he was forced to shoot their mother when she attacked him while he was out collecting lynxes from his traps. He named the other brother Kosaka, meaning biter. For a while, Sergei kept them in a cage that he'd built with his own hands while looking for places that would take them. Kosaka found a home soon enough, and Grumbler nearly did too. But when Sergei found out that the people who were interested in Grumbler wanted to use him as live bait to train hunting dogs, he pulled out of the deal and kept him instead. He just couldn't bear the thought of the creature being treated in such a cruel way. Sergei's siblings came to visit him often at their old childhood home, and they'd long since accepted his eccentric and unusual way of living. But even they thought that the bear was taking it too far. Of all people, Sergei should have known better than to keep such an unpredictable animal as a pet. But Sergei shrugged off their warnings. Grumble had the freedom to walk where he pleased and only ever slept in his cage until he turned 2 years old. But soon Sergei was forced to keep him in his cage after the nearly fully grown bear became angry with one of Sergei's dogs. Sergei jumped between the animals and got a nasty scratch across his chest for his troubles. But it became clear that Grumbler's freedom had to be reined in if Sergei hoped to keep all of his pets alive. After that, Grumbler was only allowed out if he was chained to the collar he wore around his neck. And for the next 2 years, all was well in Sergei's little patch of the woods, though his sisters refused to bring their children around to visit after the incident. By late December 2018, the snow was several feet deep, and the winter was in its deepest throes. Like every winter, Sergei and his odd collection of pets kept to the property, since hunting opportunities are virtually non-existent in the brutal Russian winters. Sergei and his closest neighbor, Dmitry, had a standing arrangement to have tea with each other at least once a month. When Dmitry braved the snow for his monthly visit, he noticed that Grumbler was pacing in frustration in his cage. He even told Sergei that the animal was surely out of his mind with confusion. Brown bears hibernated during this time, and everything in Grumbler's being was telling him to go off into the woods to find a quiet cave to lay down in for the winter. But like always, Sergei shrugged the warnings off. As soon as Dmitry left, Sergei decided that Grumbler probably just needed to stretch his legs to get rid of some of those winter jitters. He had been bad-tempered since the snow started to fall. He picked up the chain and walked out, whistling for Grumbler's attention. When the creature heard the call, he came bounding to the gate of his cage. But Grumbler had no intention of walking around on a leash. He wanted to go into the forest that was calling for him. Sergei tied the long chain to a post inside the cage, attached the other end to Grumbler's neck, and opened the gate so that he could walk a few yards out into the snow. But the moment that the chain pulled tight, Grumbler began to struggle with it. He wanted to go, to run, and to be free to do as his instincts told him. The wooden post began to creak and whine against the massive pull from the half-ton beast that was straining to rip it out of the ground. Sergei ran forwards when he saw what was about to happen, and just as the post exploded out of the snow in a shower of frozen ground, he grabbed onto the chain as Grumble was about to leap forward. Grumble's head snapped back when Sergei took hold of the chain, and instinctively, without even looking what the cause of his halt was, the animal turned around and charged towards Sergei. His massive paw hit Sergei right across his chest. caving in his sternum with a sickening crack. Sergei flew through the air, hitting the snow several feet away. His 2 dogs stormed out of the house the moment they heard the commotion. Had they not come out when they did, barking and snarling to protect their beloved human, Grumble might have even been able to regain his senses. But the 2 snarling and hysterical dogs just sent him deeper into madness. Sergei was still gasping for air. The crushed bone plate over his chest was compressing his lungs, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Grumble swiped at one of the dogs, sending him crashing into the fence of the cage where it lay unconscious, and charged at the fallen man. This time Grumble only saw red. He was out to destroy anything and everything that stood in its path, and that included the man and the second dog that was protectively keeping guard over him. Sergei saw stars in front of his eyes as the lack of air began to get the better of him. He couldn't see what was going on, but he sure heard the horrible sounds of his precious mutt being ripped to shreds. When the bear cast the dead canine aside, all its attention turned on Sergei. It bit into Sergei's head, pulling him up by the scalp and tearing at the man's body with its claws. In seconds, Sergei went limp. Even in his blind madness, Grumble realized that the man was dead and threw him aside just like he did to the dogs, before running off into the wilderness. Once Grumble ran away most of his fury, he finally came to a standstill. He needed to go into the wild, but he had no idea what to do now that he was finally there. He'd never had to seek shelter. He didn't know how to feed himself, and in the dead of winter he was as lost as a child would be. It took him 2 days to find his home again, where Sergei and his loyal dog's bodies now lay frozen. The second dog had regained consciousness and was cowering in the house, his ribs badly bruised. Before long, Grumble ate the only thing available, Sergei. By the time Sergei's family and his neighbor realized that he wasn't answering his phone, Grumble had 2 weeks to strip Sergei down to the bone, and he'd moved on to the dog. It was one of Sergei's sisters, Maria, who finally found his remains. Grumble was still pacing in the yard, protecting what was left of the corpse. When she saw the red smears on the white snow and the pile of remains, she got back into her car just as Grumble stormed at her and her madly barking dog. It took authorities 2 days before they could track down Grumble, shooting him where he was hiding in the trees. And miraculously, the dog inside the house was still alive, nearly starved to death and completely traumatized from the ordeal. Maria took him in. He was all she had left of her brother, but the family home remained in the woods, still standing there to this day, slowly decaying more and more as winter comes, streaming through the open doors every winter since Sergei Grigoriev's terrifying final affliction. Christian Prinsloo was visiting his grandmother for the 2-week school holiday that began at the end of March. In South Africa, this is a busy time for most adults, since business and work goes on just as it usually would. Luckily, Christian had plenty of family and cousins that he could go visit during the holidays, but he opted to stay with his maternal grandmother instead. Mari Stridham, even though she was 75 years old, she and Christian were very close to each other, and the boy genuinely enjoyed spending time with her. But there was another reason that Christian, or Tian, like everyone called him, liked to visit his gran. Mari lived in Elisras, a town in the north of South Africa, just a stone's throw from the Botswana border. Elisras has a large farming community with little acreages dotting the outskirts of the town for miles, and Mari was well ingrained in the community. They had nearly daily trips out to visit one friend or another, Mari usually checking in on the older members of the community if they were sick or just needed a bit of company. Tian spent those drives absorbing all of the books that the town's library had to offer, while he eagerly awaited the next stop and the next adventure. Most of those plots and farms had at least half a dozen interesting animals on it, and the residents never had a shortage of cookies and treats for the polite young man who was always willing to lend a helping hand where he could. One acreage took in abandoned gazelle calves, another had cages full of rabbits and guinea pigs, and yet another had a troop of meerkats that liked to sneak into the farm owner's house to wreak havoc. It was every 11-year-old's dream holiday, but none was more interesting than the plot they were visiting on that April in 2017. This couple kept real-life lions. It might sound extreme to us, but there are quite a few such places in South Africa. Usually, people raise abandoned cubs by hand, either to extend breeding programs, to reintroduce them into areas where inbreeding or poaching has affected the big cat populations, or just to sell off to private collectors and zoos around the world. It's a dangerous profession, but one that's taken very seriously, and always with the magnificent animal's future at the forefront. On this little patch of land, there were 3 fully grown lions, all hand-raised and about as close to tame as a wild cat could come. Tien had even played with a few cubs that found their way there before they were taken to their new homes, but these 3 had been on the property so long that it was by now their permanent home. Each had its own spacious cage, and every morning at late afternoon they were given free rein of the fenced-in 4 acres to stretch their legs, roll in the ground, and sharpen their nails on the massive mulberry trees all over the property. Their owners never allowed visitors to come over during the lions' free time, and only the husband and wife ever fed them. But by the time Tien and his gran arrived, they'd already been out for their walk and had been fed and returned to their holdings, so there was no danger to either of them being on the property at that time, or at least that's what they thought. Mari and Tien spent a few minutes chatting with the owner's wife, whose husband was out of town. Mari had known the couple for years, and so did Tien. This was just a social call to catch up over a cup of tea and to make sure that all was well with the woman who was alone so far out of town. While Mari busied herself in the kitchen with making tea for all of them, the wife stepped away to attend to an errand at the back of the house, leaving Mari and Tien in the kitchen. Tien, returning the milk to the fridge, didn't see the adult African lion poke his nose into the open kitchen door. Apparently, someone had not closed its heavy metal gate properly, and predictably, it used its newfound freedom to come to investigate Mari and Tien's unfamiliar scents. Mari saw it immediately, and as soon as her eyes fell on the creature, she moved in between her grandson and the beast in one swift motion. Tien heard her call out to him softly, and to his horror he saw what was standing right in the kitchen door. Tien was not some uninformed child. He knew full well that no matter how much a lion's been in contact with humans, it's never truly tame. The ice-cold fear that coursed through him was nearly enough to fossilize him where he stood. But his grandmother, calm and without taking her eyes off the cat, told him to get out of the kitchen and into the safety of the house. Tien did as he was told, but he wasn't as calm as Mari. Tien spun around and began to run. The moment he did, he became just another gazelle fleeing from a hunter, just like any other prey running for their lives. And even though the lion was well fed and not at all hungry, all of its natural instincts kicked into gear. In that instant, it sprang into action, knocking Mari to the ground, and with 2 strides it leapt through the air, landing on Tien's back before the boy even made it halfway across the kitchen. Its nails wrapped around his tiny shoulders, and its teeth sank into the back of Tien's neck and upper back. This male was on the younger side, its mane just having grown in fully, and it had never hunted before in its entire life. Had this been an experienced hunter, that bite would have been well aimed and it wouldn't have missed the jugular. Its full weight and the speed with which it had come at the 11-year-old slammed him to the ground with such force that 2 of his ribs and his nose broke instantly. Mari moved faster than a woman her age was supposed to. One moment the beast and the boy were on the ground, and the next Mari was on top of them. She grabbed the mane, pulling as hard as she could. The cat let go of Tian, gave an angry swipe in her direction, and turned back to its prey. Mari didn't even feel the nails raking over her forearm and shoulder. She just launched herself back at the cat, completely disregarding its growls and teeth. On its back, she yanked and pulled, screaming in primal maternal anger. The noise had alerted the homeowner, and the woman came bursting into the kitchen just as Mari launched her second attempt to pull the animal off her grandson. The woman's yells were familiar enough to pull the lion out of its natural prey drive. It pulled out its nails from the boy's back and began to backtrack toward the open door, throwing Mari off its back in the process. Mari didn't wait for the tiles to get warm beneath her. Slipping on her and her grandson's blood, she scrambled to Tian's unmoving body. The homeowner ran after the lion, got it back in its cage, and ran back to the house with the intention of calling an ambulance. But Mari was one step ahead of her. She'd grabbed the car keys off the counter, threw them at her friend, and picked up Tian like he weighed nothing. The adrenaline was fueling her now. Even at 75, with her own wounds and her age dragging her down, she suddenly could have been 20 years old again. It took them 20 minutes to reach the nearest hospital, and there the damage was starkly clear. The back of Tian's neck and his back were shredded beyond repair. He was completely unresponsive, and his breathing was shallow. Besides patching up the deepest scratches to slow the bleeding and to get him on a transfusion, all that the small-town hospital could do was wait for the helicopter to arrive to airlift Tian to Pretoria City, where the best surgeons and specialists were already waiting. Mari, on the other hand, refused all treatment, insisting to stay with her grandson. It wasn't until the aircraft disappeared into the horizon that she finally collapsed from exhaustion and grief that staff were able to stitch her up. Her wounds were deep, but not fatal, and she was released within a few days. Tian was whisked into surgery the moment he arrived, but his condition was too dire. Unless a miracle happened, there was no waking up from the intense damage that his spinal cord received. The connection between the brain and the rest of the body was severed when those teeth gripped down his spine. For 3 weeks, Tian remained in his comatose state. He was kept breathing by the machines that beeped away in the background. His parents, Herman and Adri Prinsloo, kept vigil at his bedside, begging the public for prayers, while their only child showed no signs of brain activity. 3 weeks of hell later, and Tian died just 1 day after his 12th birthday. Mari made a full recovery, but she never stopped reliving the trauma of that day. And as for the lion, in a rare twist of events, the Prinsloo family did not wish for it to be put down. They recognized that it was only acting on instinct, driven by forces beyond its control. It was rehomed to another facility or park that's never been disclosed. They did not wish to pursue legal action. They realized that it was a mistake, and whether or not it was negligence or fate, a battle in the courts would never return their sweet, animal-loving boy back from his terrifying, final affliction. Today, we look at the very preventable death of 66-year-old Norman Buwala. And even though this happened in 2012, this case actually started 10 years earlier in 2004. You see, Norman had a liking for exotic cats. The bigger and more vicious, the better. He lived in a quiet Ontario neighborhood where nothing exciting ever happened. Kids still played out on the streets. School buses arrived every morning to pick children up for school, and the older residents walked their dogs in the evening. But in that sleepy neighborhood, Norman kept no less than 5 big cats on his property. Among them were a massive 650-pound Siberian tiger, a young male African lion, a cougar, and 2 other wild cats that were never identified. Even though Norman kept their cages well maintained and his safety protocols mirrored those used in zoos, the neighbors were understandably uncomfortable having the dangerous predators right in the middle of the place where their children played every day. They couldn't do much about it. Norman was the head of the Canadian Exotic Animal Owners Association, and he knew the laws back to front. He had permits for his animals, and he passed every inspection on his cages, and the fencing around his yard was all up to standard. According to the law, Norman was within his rights to keep the dangerous predators right next to the bus stop outside of his house. But just like the neighbors feared, a terrible accident happened when a 10-year-old boy traveled all the way from Toronto to visit Norman with his parents. The boy was doing a school project on Siberian tigers, and he'd traveled all this way to get up close to the real thing. He was taking pictures of Norman's prized feline possession when the tiger struck. The poor lad had gotten right up close to the cat's enclosure when the animal lashed out and its claws raked the boy's face and neck right through the fence. The boy survived, but only barely. The lacerations on his neck were millimeters away from his main artery, just a hair to the left, and he'd have bled out in seconds. His face was left terribly scarred, and no amount of surgery was ever able to fix his now permanently crooked smile. The attack would lead to 2 years in the courts. The neighbors rightfully took it to every judge that would hear them. But Norman was within the law to keep the animals, and by some miracle he never even faced any repercussions for the boy's grievous injuries, nor was he required to get rid of the tiger. Furious, the neighborhood was forced to back down for the time being. If Norman's cages were up to standard, and he kept passing inspections, there just wasn't anything they could do about it. Just a year after Norman's last appearance in court, they dragged him back on the stand. He'd taken the teenage lion out of its cage and allowed it to play with his dogs right there in his backyard. A quick-thinking man managed to get a few photos to present to the court as evidence. Norman, for all his heavy cages and stellar inspection record, couldn't weasel out of this one. What he'd done was utterly irresponsible, and the only reason no one got hurt was because the lion was relatively young and probably hadn't been kept in a single small cage for long enough to have driven it mad with frustration yet. This was enough for the courts to force Norman to rehome the lion, cougar, and the other 3 cats on his property. But somehow, Norman managed to keep the Siberian tiger in his possession yet again. The neighbors were still fighting to change the laws in Ontario to prohibit dangerous animals from being kept on residential properties, hoping to finally be rid of the animal that had proven once before that it was perfectly capable of attacking a human being. But Norman fought them for another 2 years, all the way up to May 19th, 2012. That morning, Norman started his day as per usual. He fed his dogs, and before he took them for a walk, he headed off to visit the magnificent tiger that already sat waiting for his breakfast. The cages that Norman had installed were very much like you'd find in any zoo or park that holds animals this big and dangerous. The tiger had a large living space, stacked with straw to roll around in, and plenty of logs and tires to climb and play on. But off to the side was another smaller cage, connected to the larger one by a collapsible gate. The point of this smaller cage was to lure the animal in with food. It closed behind the tiger while it ate, leaving Norman free to clean its living space and to do maintenance. Now, if this were a zoo, the tiger would have been fed in that side holding, regardless of whether it was a cleaning day or not. No handler is allowed to feed an animal by hand or just freely walk into the cage with the creature, no matter how big or small they are. But just like with his lion, Norman wasn't all too fussed about protocol. He'd convinced himself that the tiger was tame, just like he believed the lion was when he allowed it to run around his yard. So holding a bowl full of raw elk meat, he walked into the cage, latched the door behind him, and placed the bowl in front of the hungry tiger. But then he did what no man should ever do in the presence of a predatory cat. On his way out, he turned his back on the creature. Even with the food in front of it, it just couldn't resist its natural instinct to go for the warm, living prey instead. The attack would have been quick. Norman, with no place to run, already on the older side at 66 years old, just didn't stand a chance. When the animal bit into Norman's neck, it didn't just tear out his throat, it nearly decapitated him. The predator, now with a fresh kill at its disposal, forgot all about the chunks of elk behind it and focused on eating Norman instead. For 2 hours it devoured him in peace before Norman's cousin, who just happened to come around for an unannounced visit, came upon the grisly scene. By that time, there wasn't much left of Norman to remove from the cage. Everything between his feet and chest were already consumed, and the tiger's blood-stained snout was enough to send Norman's cousin into hysteria. She went into such a state of shock that she required 3 nights in the psych ward under sedation after the discovery. The only 2 positive things that could be taken from this horrible event was that Norman remembered to at least latch the gate shut behind him, or the animal would have certainly made its way out into the neighborhood. And secondly, the neighbors were finally vindicated, even if it was thanks to the rather morbid death of the very man that gave them so many sleepless nights. The tiger miraculously again avoided a death penalty. The family were allowed to sell it off to a private collector whose identity was never disclosed. The neighbors went onto the property themselves to dismantle the cages once the tiger was gone, but to their horror, they discovered that Norman had installed 2 brand new holdings. Apparently, he was planning on restocking his property with even more ferocious cats before his death. This last fatal report and the fact that Norman was planning on procuring more animals was enough to finally get the change in laws that Ontario needed. That's not to say that private owners can't keep vicious animals on their properties anymore, but they can't be kept in residential areas, and the procedures to obtain licensing to keep them have become so strict that it's almost too much of a hassle to even bother to try getting approved. On this channel, we never celebrate the death of another human being, no matter how irresponsible they were, but at least some good came out of the horrible ordeal. No lions, tigers, bears, or even venomous snakes can pose a threat to the residents of Ontario ever again, and will never bring another person like Norman Buwala to their terrifying final affliction.